Good afternoon and welcome back to the Bellingham City Council committee meetings. Today is Monday, October 11th, 2021. So we are starting this afternoon with Committee of the Whole, a little bit later than normal. We had an extended break today to allow members of the council as well as staff and members of the public in hopes that people would attend the Indigenous Peoples Day event that was hosted by Western Washington University, and the City of Bellingham was a co-sponsor in that event. So this afternoon with Committee of the Whole, we have just one absence with respect to council members. So Councilmember Anderson, her presence is excused this afternoon, but I see all other council members are present. So we have a quorum and we'll move forward with the Committee of the Whole. So we have a number of items before us this afternoon. And before we start, I guess the first four items are all related. And they're regarding initiatives that have been placed on the ballot for this November. And so I just wanted to speak briefly because it's in connection with all four of these items, but I've heard what appears to be some, I guess, lack of clarity maybe in the public with respect to these initiatives moving forward. And I know that we've discussed this multiple times before, so staff, bear with me. But I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of things with respect to all four of these initiatives. So this is considered direct legislation. So those items being brought forward to the council from members of the public, right, who have acquired the requisite number of signatures required to bring those items forward. And so each of those obtained the required number of signatures and they came before the council. And at that time, the council had some limited options before us, either deferring those items to the voters, rejecting the measures and proposing an alternate measure or alternative measure that would appear on the ballot, or enacting the initiative. And so I just want to be clear that the council did not move forward with enacting any of these initiatives, but we could have done so if there was support by the council to pass the initiatives as they were presented. And so that did not happen. And similarly, we didn't have, in some cases, I think there was consensus that there wasn't really sufficient time to do justice to the amendments that would be required to bring forward an alternative to the voters. And so that's just to highlight that the council was viewing some areas of concern with respect to these initiatives about things that we would hope to see resolved or amended prior to enacting the legislation. And so because the requisite number of votes or signatures, were brought these items forward, at that point, it only makes sense to sort of forward these items on to the voters and to allow the voters to decide. And on the ballot, it does state, whether it's basically asking, should this measure in each case be adopted or not? And so voters will vote yes or no. And I just want to be clear that there are some restrictions within our charter that if these initiatives are adopted by the voters, they are enacted. I believe it's within 10 days of that being finalized. And we are not able to amend or rescind these items for a period of 2 years. So I just want to say that one more time. If these initiatives are passed by the voters, they are enacted as is, and it's outside of our control or jurisdiction to amend in any way or to rescind these for a period of 2 years. And so I just want to be clear because I've heard members of the public highlight some concern or questions about some of the initiatives, but sort of placing faith in the fact that, it just needs to go forward to the council and then it can be taken care of and those items can be, sort of worked out. And so I apologize if maybe this isn't the right format or forum to bring those comments forward, but I just wanted to be clear with the public about these items before we begin those discussions this afternoon. And so before us this afternoon, we do have each initiative brought forward for before us. So The first is Agenda Bill 23045. So this is a review of Initiative 2021-01, Renter Relocation Assistance. So the council adopted a resolution to place the initiative 2021-01 on the general election ballot in November after it had received the required number of signatures as affirmed by the Whatcom County Auditor. The initiative bill would create a renter relocation assistance program and puts a number of requirements related to rental increases and subsequent landlord actions. And so that's all we have in the summary, but I know that, so Deputy Administrator Brian Heinrich is listed as presenter, so I don't know if you wanted me to turn this over to you or if this was to go before council, but Mr. Heinrich.
Thank you, Brian Heinrich, Mayor's Office. Before we get started, I'm actually going to ask Senior Assistant City Attorney James Erb to make a couple of comments related to our discussion today. James?
Yes, thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, Council. James Erb here. I just wanted to remind everybody that the City Attorney's Office provided information to Council back in July with respect to each of these 4 initiative measures. We provided information both in a confidential legal memorandum to the City Council, as well as during executive session in late July, where we were able to provide legal analysis about each of these measures and answer any legal questions with respect to the effect of each of these 4 initiative measures and potential legal issues with them. The purpose of the discussion this afternoon will be for Mr. Heinrich to speak more to some of the policy questions around these initiative measures, but we're not going to be spending time in open session today talking about some of those legal issues. And so if you do have any questions that relate more to those types of issues, I recommend that we schedule an executive session to discuss those matters under potential litigation, or refer you back to our earlier discussions and the memorandum that we additionally sent out last week as well as a reminder for everybody.
Thank you, James. So hopefully Council had a moment to review not only the memo that was prepared, but in addition, we provided the explanatory statement as provided by the auditor, as well as the initiative, the actual initiative language from your previous meeting. So to be really honest, I'm not 100% sure what questions Council might have. We tried to lay out the memo in a way that articulates what each of these, and you'll see all 4 are drafted in a similar fashion. It lays out the intent, or at least the language of each initiative in those bulleted format. We tried to articulate, if it's known, what the impact is to the capital C City of Bellingham, so us as a corporate entity, and then the other section is what, if it's known, again, what might the impacts be to our community. And a couple of things to keep in mind is Council President Stone said that should these be enacted, there is a 2-year timeframe before they can be amended or addressed by Council in some fashion. Additionally, if any of these are subject to a legal challenge, if they're adopted, the city would be obligated to defend them. So those are a couple of the considerations that are for all 4 initiatives. So with the information and the materials in your packet, if there's questions we can answer, we're certainly available. And throughout our discussion on these 4 initiatives, periodically I may be joined by other staff as relevant to their area of expertise.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I appreciate you highlighting that. Was the other point I intended to raise, was that if passed, then obviously the city's time and resources in defending those initiatives as enacted would obviously be ours to do so. So are there any questions from council members? Councilmember Hamel and then Lillquist.
Yeah, I just wanted council to know that the questions that I had were legal in nature, and I've already spoken with Attorney James Erb and got those questions answered, and I have no further questions regarding these initiatives for this process here today.
Thank you. Councilmember Lillquist.
Yeah, I have two questions. One about this initiative and then a more general question. About this initiative, Section 7 says a landlord shall provide notice to the City of Bellingham of all notices requesting payment of relocation assistance and also all payments of relocation assistance within 30 days. It seems to me like we're going to have to put some serious caveats on this. I don't think the city will be in a position to verify the truth of what landlords report to us. I'm assuming that we're going to keep some database and record of notices sent to us, but I don't think we'll be in a position to say whether or not these things are actually happened, when they happened, and how they happened. I mean, is that kind of the sense of staff that we're just going to simply take a recording of what's sent to us and we're not going to vouch for its truth?
It's a good question, Michael, and I think you're correct. Obviously we have our own rental registration program, but we don't track that's more with do those items conform to code and things of that nature. So the rental registration really is more of a, I guess the way I think about it is affirming the safety of a dwelling, making sure that, again, electrical things of that nature, plumbing, et cetera, aren't out of compliance. And so I think you're right. I think in this section, we're a repository of that information. I don't know to what degree we would be able to, as a city, be able to sort of truth it, as you suggested. So I think you're
right. For the inspection, there's an in-person inspection, and the inspector signs their name to it. Basically, vouching for its truthfulness. The more general question is, City Council can't take action within 2 years to make any changes or improvements or, to them. Could these initiatives be amended by initiative? Could direct legislation change them? Because the charter specifically says City Council cannot, but direct legislation isn't the City Council.
I might have to lean on James Erb or Alan Mayer to help answer that one.
That's a good question, Councilmember Lucas. I think it would require a little bit more research to be able to answer it, but I do agree with you that the charter provision that we're talking about specifically states that council may not amend or modify a bill that's enacted by initiative within 2 years after it passes. So that language is pretty specific. But it would necessitate additional research to determine whether that would bind the hands of the people from trying to amend a measure by further direct legislation.
Are there any additional questions or comments from council members related to this particular initiative about renter relocation assistance? Councilmember Vargas.
Thank you. I was just kind of looking through the notes in regards to what the impacts are on the city, and in regards to tracking all of these rental fees or doing the notices from the landlords. It says that we could maybe tie it into our rental registration program, but I'm wondering if we have some sort of estimate on kind of the time, like, are we going to need additional staffing in order to do this? I mean, that's one of the challenges of people's initiatives is that there is, in regards to how it's going to get done or how it's going to get paid for, is not vetted. And that is obviously my concern at the city is who's going to do the work and who's going to have to pay for it. So I'm just kind of curious what kind of estimate maybe we think this will have on the city in regards to managing it.
That's a really good question. And again, I'm sorry to answer it this way. It's a bit unknown. This is one of the challenges of this particular initiative is understanding what that impact is. But I think you're right to identify that there would be a staff impact, in terms of we're going to be the recipient of some of these notices from landlords. How do we manage that? How do we track it? What's the obligation there? So it certainly would have an impact on staff. It's unknown if that is an impact that could be assumed by existing staff. I might that seems again, it seems unlikely, given that what they currently manage, and this would be an increased, and it would be a monthly, it seems to me it would be a monthly updating of existing information. So there would be an impact on staff, but again, it's unknown if that would require additional staff to manage.
Councilmember Vargas.
I wonder if I could just have a little follow-up question on that. So, we're a little short-staffed in planning, and we're already short on resources. So I'm kind of wondering, so if these initiatives get enacted, do they become more of a priority than the things that we already have on the docket in regards to, does this get prioritized? Do these get prioritized ahead of the other things that we need to take care of? I'm just kind of trying to work this out. We're already low on resources, so I'm just curious how that works.
It's a good question. I don't know that it gets prioritized ahead of other work. I think we would have to develop a plan on how to incorporate it in our existing work. So again, sort of the theme of it's unknown what the ultimate impact would be on city staff, on city resources. But per the way it's written, we would, it seems to me, in fairly short order, become the recipient of some additional information that we would have to manage per the initiative. So I think it's a question of programming what resources we have, what staff we have to make sure we're accommodating that information that we receive.
Yeah, Mr.
I just wanted to add one thing to what Mr. Heinrich said, which is, and I think Council President Stone mentioned this earlier, that under our charter, if one or any of these initiatives passes, it takes effect 10 days after the final canvassing of ballots by the Whatcom County Auditor, which typically occurs in late November. So we're thinking it's going to be early to mid-December when these, if any of the initiatives pass, that they would take effect. If this particular one, 2021-01, were to pass, we could expect to start receiving these notices as soon as January of 2022, and having to, there's two sections that include notice provisions. One is just a passive receipt of information by the city in Section 7. In Section 9, the city receives notice that a rental unit qualifies for an exception from the landlord having to provide the rental relocation assistance. And the city is obligated under this initiative bill to provide some sort of acknowledgement of receipt of that notice that is then delivered to the tenant, so that they're on notice that they're not going to receive rental relocation assistance if their rent is increased by more than 8% in a rolling 12-month period of time, or if there's a termination of their lease without cause. So there is some work by city staff that is contemplated under Section 9, whereas Section 7 is really just the passive receipt of information.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from council members or staff?
I have additional comment. When the initiative speaks to the creation of the rental relocation assistance program, it appears, given how it's written, that is a program not of the city or another agency. It would be individual landlords that would manage that program. And I don't know if James wants to speak to this or not, but it also gives, in a scenario in which a tenant, either a tenant has their rent raised beyond the 5% limit, or isn't afforded the various rights that the initiative articulates, it suggests that the right of action after that is the court of competent jurisdiction. And so I just wanted to flag that as something that I think would be difficult for the city. Doesn't have an involvement, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at in that scenario. It would be between individual landlords and their either current or former tenants.
Thank you for that clarification. Other members of council or staff? Okay. Seeing none, this item as well as the following three are before us for information and discussion only. So then moving forward, the next is Agenda Bill 23047. So this is review of Initiative 2021-02, restricting use of police technologies. The council adopted a resolution to place Initiative 2021-02 on the November general election ballot after it had received the required number of signatures as affirmed by the Whatcom County Auditor. Initiative 2021-02 would restrict the use of police technology, including facial recognition, software, and predictive police technology. Neither of these technologies are used currently by the Bellingham Police Department. For this, I'll turn to, I guess, to you again, Deputy Heinrich, if you have any initial remarks.
Thank you, Brian Heinrich, Mayor's Office. So as the summary statement, as well as the memorandum address, neither of these technologies are currently used by the Bellingham Police Department. Chief Flo Simon is here today. If you have questions for her regarding the department's use of that, or lack of use, I should say, of that technology. I don't recall the exact time frame, but there was some previous predictive policing technology that was used. But like I said, we don't currently use that today. And just one comment is that should this initiative be adopted, it would prohibit our use in the future. So we wouldn't be able to use either of those technologies should we want to at a future date. And I don't know if Chief Simon has anything she would like to add.
Thanks, Deputy Director Heinrich. Good afternoon, Council and Mayor. The only thing I would add is that when we did use the predictive policing software in 2016, we were successful in solving a series of crimes. And as you might recall, I think I spoke about this before, but we only used it for predicting times and places that crimes would occur in certain areas. For example, we had a series of robberies at stores. And so we uploaded the data into the predictive policing software, and we were able to map out a likely occurrence based on the time and place. And we were actually able to capture somebody during that time frame committing the crime. It was in progress. So that was successful, but we stopped using it probably in 2018. We were having a lot of upload issues, and the cost to maintain it was a little high. So until it evolves a little further, we just decided to shelf it.
Thank you, Chief Simon. Any questions from council members? Councilmember Lillquist?
A couple things. First, Chief Simon, I believe that, I don't know, 2 or 3 months ago, my request the council approved. We requested kind of a written statement from you, from the police department, about your policies on predictive policing and facial recognition software. As you indicate, you don't use them, and you said out loud what those reasons and the reasoning was, but I asked for it in writing. Last month, I said you're still working on it. I understand you're very busy. Is there any chance that kind of a written form of the policies and the thinking that police department uses on these technologies might be available for public dissemination?
I do actually have that prepared for you, Councilmember Lillquist, and it speaks to both those things that you just mentioned. Facial recognition isn't to a place, it hasn't evolved to a place where we as a police department are comfortable using it, and we have no policies regarding that, but I have drafted you a memo that I will forward to each of you.
Thank you, Chief Simon. Councilmember Vargas.
Thank you, Chief. I know that some of this technology is a little bit controversial because it's not all worked out yet. But I'm curious if you feel this would, as the technology evolves, would bind the police department in any way of maybe possibly being able to utilize these tools in a positive manner.
Yes, I think that the predictive policing software actually is to a point where it could be used. The facial recognition isn't. However, putting a ban on predictive policing and facial recognition it's been done with a broad brush. And so if we were to employ the predictive policing software for, say, a kidnapping crime or, a serious crime, and there's a ban on us being able to do that, it hinders our ability to solve that crime in a reasonable amount of time. So it does cause some problems for us into the future.
Thank you.
Councilmember Lillquist.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that point exactly, Chief Simon. As you say, the definition of predictive policing is very broad. It includes, kind of speculation about the sort of person that might commit a crime, kind of like pre-crime, like a science fiction movie, but also what you referred to, which is where have crimes occurred in the past, and therefore where might we expect further crimes to continue? Place, right? And time rather than person. And that seems very, very different. I'm worried that simply charting high crime districts and dispatching patrols and patrol frequency is predictive policing under the current definition. And I assume we do that. I assume we keep track of where property crimes are highest. It's often like in downtown and commercial areas, and we patrol accordingly, right? We're sort of predicting that crimes will be likely where they have been in the past. And to help prevent that, we're going to try to be there ahead of time, looking out for trouble. That sounds like predictive policing to me, even if it doesn't use the latest technology. It still uses technology and information.
It does.
If I may, I would direct your attention to section 2, number 5, that has the definition of what, at least for the purposes of this initiative, predictive policing technology means software that is used to predict information or trends. And it goes on to explain some of those particular items.
Well, I don't know. Everything's in software. I put everything in a spreadsheet. Our crime database is in software. It's the way the way the language is written. All our databases are software, and if we use them to dispatch patrols, it seems to me, arguably, that's predictive in some sense. I mean, am I going out on a limb, or might that be an easy and natural interpretation?
Well, I think you're hitting on one of the challenges again, as mentioned with the previous initiative, the ambiguity or the way this is written. It really is a little bit of an unknown in terms of, does that, to your example, does it prevent, or would it prevent sending police resources to areas of higher criminal activity? Potentially. I guess, I don't know if Chief Simon has any thoughts on that, but again, it's the ambiguity of how this is written. I think it's a real challenge to understand what is that impact to the city of Bellingham and our police department.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement. Just because it's not called predictive policing software, we still have the ability to pull up those high crime areas and dispatch resources to that area. So it is a little bit vague.
Well, if it's passed into law, Chief Simon, you will need to have guidance of our city attorney's office on how to interpret it, right?
Yes.
Any additional questions from council members, either for Chief Simon or Mr. Erb or Deputy Administrator Heinrich? Councilmember Vargas?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, there's a point in here where it talks about a risk to the city should the measure be passed as a potential that we could be challenged in court and the city would be obligated to defend it in court. It is unknown at this time what the cost, both monetarily as well as our staff, this would present. So I'm a little confused in regards to what this would mean. It sounds like if we ever use the software, then we would have to take ourselves to court. Like, I'm kind of a little a little perplexed by what this is saying. Am I understanding that right? Like, let's say there was something that the police had to use some technology for, but the city would have to enforce the not use. I don't know. I'm kind of struggling with what our role is at the city and how to support the police department in this one. I'm kind of a little confused.
So that statement, thank you, Pinky. That statement is meant that should the initiative pass, this initiative or any of the 4 initiatives pass, and there is someone who wants to challenge the validity of that initiative, the city would be obligated to defend that in court, that initiative in court. James, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, that's exactly correct, Brian. So any of these initiatives, if they pass, they have the same force and effect as an ordinance that is adopted by council and then signed by the mayor. It will become the law of the city of Bellingham, and the mayor is obligated under the city's charter to enforce all the laws of the city. That type of language is typically interpreted by the courts to mean that the executive has to defend the laws that are duly passed, whether they be by direct legislation or by the typical legislative process. And so I think that was the point that Mr. Heinrich was meaning in his memo, is for any of these measures, if they're challenged in any capacity, in any way, shape, or form, it will be the obligation of the city to defend them.
But to your question, Pinky, I would direct you to sections 7, 8, and 9 of the initiative, and that's articulates that predictive policing technology is unlawful, retention of that data is unlawful, and then it has a couple sections, or I'm sorry, it was one section, section 9 on enforcement, which is effectively a court of competent jurisdiction, which I believe for all 3 of these, and James can correct me, I believe is Superior Court.
Yes, that's correct.
Councilmember Vargas.
Sorry, one more thing. So, something that I am very concerned about in regards to human trafficking, and we use whatever tools we can to track down in regards to human trafficking. So I am a little concerned on that. And I also have another thought in regards to, right now, trying to recruit police officers, trying to find a new police chief. All of those things are very challenging. We are in a culture right now that does not support our police departments. And I realize there's lots of reasons for that. And I respect what's going on in our community around social justice. But I also am concerned about our police officers feeling like they have all the tools they need to get the job done and to keep our community safe and to solve things. So I'm a little concerned whether or not this might also impede us in regards to the future of whether it's hiring police officers or a new police chief, about whether or not they're going to be able to use any technology to help them, and if that will be a deterrent for us in recruiting police officers and a police chief. So I kind of feel like that might tie some of the hands of the police officers. So I'm just trying to think down the road of what some of these consequences will be if some of these things get implemented. So just, I guess that's not really a question, sorry. It's just more of a thought of like, ooh, what are some of the impacts going to be? But if anyone wants to say anything on that, that's fine. If not, it's not really a question. It's just a concern, I guess.
Thanks, Councilmember Vargas. Additional questions or comments from council members or staff with respect to this particular initiative, so restricting use of police technologies? No. Okay. There are no additional questions on this item. Again, this is for information and discussion only at this point. the next agenda bill before us is Agenda Bill 23048. So this is review of Initiative 2021-03, Neutrality in Labor Campaigns. So the council adopted a resolution to place Initiative 21-03 on the November general election ballot after it had received the required number of signatures as affirmed by the Whatcom County Auditor. Initiative 2021-03 would define and restrict the use of city funds in campaigns to discourage unionization. It also establishes that the city would be obligated to track city funds after payment for goods and services. So again, for this item, I'll turn first to Deputy Administrator Brian Heinrich, if you have any initial comments, and then open it up to council.
Thank you. I do have a couple of things I just wanted to point out, and it's listed both in the memo and obviously in the initiative text, but it's that section on, it's actually the fourth bullet in your memo, requires a segregation of city funds and requires that recipients of city funds segregate its activities that are city funded from any of the recipients' activities that might discourage unionization. And so if you'll bear with me, just for context, an example might be if there were an online retailer that the city did business with who was discouraging unionization efforts in another part of the country. We would require that they could demonstrate that the city funds that they received were not put towards that effort. And that strikes me as a very real challenge that I'm not sure how we would require, whether it's an individual, someone that we pay, an employee, or an agency or a retailer or a contractor or what have you that provided a good or service to the city. We would be asking them to demonstrate that the city funds, after we are in receipt of that, whatever we paid them for, wasn't used towards to discourage unionization somewhere. So very problematic to segregate city funds, I think, after we pay someone, after we, once the dollars go out the door, so to speak, they become that individuals or that agency, that company's dollars. And so the challenge, should this be adopted, is how we would meet the spirit of that intent and structure a program that could do so. I'm not, to be really candid, I'm not sure we would be able to do that. I don't know if James wants to provide any additional information. I know we're also joined by Finance Director Andy Osbjornson, who might be able to speak to some of these challenges as well. But that strikes me as a very challenging one for us to meet.
Thank you, Brian. I don't have anything additional to add to those concerns that you outlined there.
So I guess the follow-up to that, because to me, it's very clear how difficult that would be. I guess I don't know if Director Asbjornson or anybody else is there any example of something similar that's been done either for, I don't know, all I can think of is for, I don't know. I can't think of one, but if there's an example of a time, because otherwise I know internally, right, when we have specific dollars that are earmarked or designated or, they have to be tracked. Clearly, obviously, that's all done internally with money we're receiving, but money going out. Director Osbjornson, do you have any experience or examples of something akin to what's representative in this initiative?
Not how this is structured. With grant funds, they come with restrictions and specific uses and purposes for the funds because we're providing those funds for a purpose. I haven't seen anything when it comes to our purchase of goods and services. I think Brian's example presents a very difficult challenge. Just last week, we issued 113 checks and 108 EFTs. We also have credit card transactions that could go out to any number of vendors or in town or outside of town on travel. So it prevents, or it is definitely challenging trying to evaluate how this would be implemented.
Thank you. Additional questions, Councilmember Lillquist?
A small question and a bigger one. The small question is, in our accounting scheme, do we keep track of when something is quote unquote a reimbursement? So let's say an employee goes to a workplace meeting and they buy their own lunch. And if it's a workplace meeting, they might get a per diem and reimbursed for those, meal expenses. I assume we flag that as a reimbursement. Other than that kind of thing, is anything else flagged as a reimbursement? Because one of the things the initiative does is that if you get the money as a reimbursement, then that doesn't count. We're not talking about reimbursement. But if someone, builds a bridge for us, is any of that tagged as reimbursement?
We consider those grant funds for the most part. If we're talking about either federal or state funds that come to the city, we recognize those as revenues and then recognize the expenses as our own. So those are awarded to the city. We trying to think of any other reimbursement opportunities. Even when we do reimburse an employee for travel, for a meal, that would still be then the city's expense to pay for that meal. We're just reimbursing the employee for having that expense prior to reimbursement. So if we were to reimburse someone who paid for a permit and then that permit was not issued or they pulled back on that permit and we provided their money back, that would be, I think, a sense of reimbursement that doesn't count as a purchase from the city. So I would say the per diems, those could potentially go towards the related purchase.
So the larger question, is there something like a legal theory about the fungibility of money? I mean, that's the whole point behind currency, is a dollar is a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. That's like bedrock of what currency means. If I have $99 and you give me one and you ask for the dollar back, I can give you any of those dollars back. They're blended, they're blurred. I'm just having a hard time even understanding how if someone earns money, we can say that money is still ours. Isn't it theirs?
I think we have the same concern.
The point behind payment is the money is no longer theirs. As you say, Mr. Osbjornson, if we accept a grant to do some function from the federal government, it isn't that that particular dollar is theirs. We spend it for the purpose. If we do, then there's no problem. If we don't spend it, then we return the money, but it's sort of like ours until we spend it or return it. It's not still theirs. I don't know. I mean, is there like established legal principles on when you pay someone, whether or not that money is still yours or is theirs?
In general, I haven't seen ongoing restriction on a dollar. So if we were to buy a good or service, that's what we paid for. I don't see how that dollar can be used on something else after that from a city's perspective. But that's an ongoing, discussion.
Other questions from council members or comments from staff?
I might just add one consideration in the memo does address this a little bit, is that should this be enacted, it's likely there would be a significant impact on the finance department rather, in terms of how to staff, how to manage workloads, and all those things that we would have to create to manage this process. As Andy acknowledged just in his example, I think, Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but your example in terms of the amount of checks and payment and things that go through your office on a weekly basis, I mean, it's a weekly basis. That's a weekly occurrence. And it seems that to staff appropriately to meet the spirit of this would be very challenging, very difficult.
Councilmember Lillquist.
I mean, are we reading this that we would have to track every recipient's expenditures, or theoretically? So let's say we have a vendor, we give them $100. They actually have $2,000 in revenue that month, and they have $1,800 in expenses. Did they spend our 100, or do they still have our 100 as part of their unspent amount?
It's a good question.
We don't know how much their total revenue is or how much they spent. And we don't know if they spent, quote unquote, our money or spent other money. I mean, even if they showed us their books, we wouldn't be able to answer the fundamental question of whether or not they spent, quote unquote, our money or spent, quote unquote, their money.
I would, to try and answer that, I would direct you to section 4 of the initiative, which is, I'm not sure what page that is. Section 4 of the initiative requiring the segregation of city funds. And then it does, I think, to try and answer your question, Michael, section 4, number 2, each recipient of city funds shall physically and financially segregate its activities that are city funded from any of the recipient's activities that involve discouragement of unionization. And then it walks through a couple of other requirements in that particular section.
So there are probably thousands of recipients of city dollars. Are we going to give them guidance on how they're supposed to document their segregation of funds?
I'm not sure we know how we would do that, Michael. So it would be difficult to say that we will provide that guidance. I think that would be part of the discussion should this be adopted that we're going to have to answer. So I think the short answer is probably yes, but I can't tell you that we know how we would do this at this point.
Councilmember Vargas.
Thanks. I'm curious about something like, okay, so we have 9 bargaining units right now. Most of our employees at the city are union, and in my 8 years, I'm only speaking for myself. I have never heard a complaint from any of the union workers that there is any kind of suppression of unions or non-encouragement. To my knowledge, we are a very strong union city, and we haven't had any issues around organization with unions. So I'm a little confused in regards to where the need came from this. And I'm curious from Brian or the mayor, or I guess legal, has this been a concern? I mean, I never knew about this. Has this ever come up before?
Not that I'm aware of in my time with the city. You're correct. We have nine bargain units. And in fact, I think if not this council, certainly previous councils have adopted resolutions or statements that support the right of bargain employees. I can say that in the various roles I've had with the city, we've worked very well with our labor groups. That doesn't mean we always agree, but it's certainly not a question of do we support their right to collectively bargain or to unionize or things of that nature. So yeah, all we have to go off of is, I think, the language in the initiative itself to try and understand what problem this is trying to solve.
I guess that's part of my concern as well with this is whether the actual initiative achieves the desired end, or because I could see something broader when we're talking about certain restrictions, say for apprenticeship programs, and sort of encouraging or having a threshold where we're prioritize or prioritize who the city works with or engages with, and saying, well, if there was overt evidence of a particular contractor or company being involved in work that we didn't want to condone or support, but the depth to which the enforcement and accountability, like the heavy lift that would require, and how to even imagine at this point making that feasible. And then even if it was feasible, I'm just concerned with sort of the disconnect for me personally about the initiative and how that work, achieves what I would think the end would be. So I don't know if other council members have any questions or concerns to be highlighted. Councilmember Lillquist.
All right. Every time I read this, it confuses me. On the enforcement section, it refers repeatedly to enforcement actions being initiated by an employee. Who are we assuming the employee is? Are we assuming that there's a business that's receiving money from the city for, like I said, building a bridge, and it's the employee of the business? Are they referring to employees of the city who themselves receive a paycheck and therefore city money? Does this bill give legal standing to employees but not to non-employees? Let's say there is a contractor and I think they're doing a prohibited act, but I'm not an employee. Do I have standing? But if I'm an employee of that company, then do I have standing? Has standing been given in that enforcement section and other people don't have standing?
Again, it speaks to the ambiguity with how these are written. I think it's a good question, Michael. I don't know if James has any thoughts on that. It strikes me the way that it's written is that it's more generic to any employee of any company that would have been the recipient of funding from the city for goods or services, and then that company, if they were able to demonstrate that they didn't segregate their funds and then use some of those funds for an anti-unionization effort, it seems to me that it's referencing the generic employee of any organization.
I would concur with Brian's opinion there. I believe it's referring to employees of private enterprises, meaning outside of the city, who are receiving city funds, where those employers are engaged in efforts to discourage unionization. Those would be the complainants, if you will. And they're complaining not to a court of competent jurisdiction, but to the city. The city would have the obligation to investigate those complaints and determine whether they're meritorious, and then take remedial action, either by requiring the contractors or the recipients of city funds to refund the money for a first instance, or to cancel the contract summarily for a second instance. It's all, it's not entirely clear.
So if the requirement really here is to segregate the funds and allocate them properly, it's kind of a bookkeeping issue. Could a company who was accused of spending city funds for prohibited activity come into compliance by basically reassigning costs and doing the bookkeeping properly? Could compliance simply mean resegregating the funds in a way which is compliant?
It's a terrific question.
I think I would again direct you to section 4 of the initiative, number 2, 2A and 2B, I believe, try and answer that question, Michael. But again, it's unclear in the way in which this is written, if that's possible.
Thank you, Mr. Heinrich. Yeah, that section, especially B, says that separate accounting alone doesn't suffice. But I guess my concern, this highlights, I think, what a number of the concerns I have with these different initiatives is that although I may not disagree, and I may actually support sort of the underlying policy and the principles. The wording and the way in which the initiative is brought forward being overly broad and sort of ambiguous in lots of respects creates, as we've highlighted, a number of concerns and potential problems. But I mean, the questions that Councilmember Lillquist has raised, as he said, the more I review these, the more questions and the increased lack of clarity I have versus moving in the opposite direction, right? Try and wrap your head around, okay, if initiatives are passed by the voters and come back to us, how do we respond and actually move forward with implementation? And so when Councilmember Lillquist is speaking to employees, and especially if you're talking about the employee of someone with whom we've contracted, that money potentially is supporting that individual employee's salary or, their livelihood. And so I'm not certain what this accomplishes, these accounting practices and separation. If the entity is still able to engage in work that is counter to unionization using other funds, then I don't see how this actually moves that work, the good work, I guess, forward. But Councilmember Lillquist.
Yeah, I mean, a good point. I mean, I'm a strong supporter of unionization and the right to organize. So again, this isn't about unionization. I think the city already is the council is definitely on record as being in support of union rights, right? And if there's other policies and practices we can do which protect that right, we should do them. Okay, but I'm now reading the pro rata section, and it seems even stranger to me. Any funds that are not part of this reimbursement, just whatever monies are qualified, shall be allocated on a pro rata basis to all expenditures of the recipient. So if I'm a business and I have $1 million of revenue and $10 of that is from the city, do I put like 0.001% of city money to all of my expenditures, some microscopic percentage, or let's say it's 10%? Does that go to every expenditure? Now let's say 10% of my revenues from the city. Is 10% of all my expenditures carrying supposedly a city dollar in them? I mean, maybe you can't fix it with bookkeeping then. If it's assigned on a prorated basis to all expenses. I don't know if staff looked at that pro rata issue. It seems to say it's supposed to be assigned to all expenses. I don't know. I'm sorry.
Well, don't apologize. You're hitting upon the challenges, I think, that for those of us that have read through this, trying to understand that question among several others that have already been addressed is how would we as a city meet the intent of this initiative? And the answer is, unfortunately, I'm not sure. It's not even sure if it's possible, but you're asking the right questions, Michael, and I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer for you.
Because if it passes, we're going to not only need to know what to do on our end, but we're going to need to be able to advise people who are affected by this, which is almost everybody gets what they also, it refers to services of value from the city. So I mean, almost everyone is caught in this net. And I'm not sure what we're supposed to advise them to do in terms of segregating their funds. I don't know.
There are additional questions from council. So I guess I have one question. One final question, and it may apply to all of the initiatives, and perhaps a question for Mr. Erb. I don't know if you're able to answer it or not, but when we talk about intent, right, when there are areas of ambiguity, we're trying to determine how best to interpret that. Where does that quote unquote power lie? Does that then fall to the council and legal to resolve those ambiguities, or where do we have other resources, or, I mean, in this case, when there is a signatory proponent for the initiative, what, if any, role do they play in clarifying those ambiguities?
That's a tricky question, Council President Stone. If any of these measures end up in front of a reviewing judge, and each one could get there in any number of ways, in order to ascertain the meaning of these measures and the law as it is adopted by the voters, the court, they don't look to the intent of the drafter here. Instead, when you're dealing with direct legislation, they look at the intent of how a member of the public voting on one of these initiative measures what would their understanding of it be when they're voting for it. And that's the intent question that a reviewing court would try to answer, is what was the common understanding of your average voter who voted in favor of this measure? What did they understand they were voting for? And it's a very difficult question to answer, particularly when you have initiative bills like the 4 that are before you this afternoon.
So there's a reasonable voter out there somewhere as well.
That's right. It's a reasonable voter standard.
Very good. Okay. Any additional questions or concerns or interests regarding this particular initiative? So again, this is 2021-03 neutrality in labor campaigns. Okay. Seeing none, again, this is for information only at this point. So moving forward, the next agenda bill would be 23049. So this is review of initiative 2021-04, fair treatment of hourly wage and gig workers. The council adopted a resolution placing initiative 2021-04 on the November general election ballot after it received the required number of signatures, as affirmed by the Whatcom County Auditor. Initiative 2021-04 would require all employers in the city, including the city itself, to pay employees a $4 per hour in hazard pay or its equivalent in the prorated salary premium if a state of emergency is declared in any jurisdiction, which includes the city of Bellingham. It would also establish requirements for how employers schedule employees, require additional compensation for work schedule changes, and prohibit employers from engaging in patterns of underscheduling workers. So that's the summary. This is the 4th of the 4 initiatives that we're reviewing today. So for Deputy Administrator Brian Heinrich, I don't know if you have any additional opening comments.
I do. Just want to maybe clarify a couple of things. On the fiscal impact, that $5 to $7 million annual impact is if the emergency was in place for an entire year. So everyone's aware we've been under various emergency declarations, whether it's federal, state, or local, since March of 2020. And so those remain in place. Absent COVID emergency, though, the way this is written is that any subsequent emergency would trigger this clause. And so I just wanted to point out that, and I think I actually put this in the memo that perhaps not, that in July there was a wildfire emergency declared by the governor. It would seem that this would trigger that. And typically these types of emergencies don't last as long as the COVID one. So nearly 20 months in or 19 months in. But just did a little bit of work to see how many various declarations were in place, emergency proclamations, as it were. just Whatcom County alone, so the entity Whatcom County, in 2019, they had 2. In 2020, there were 6. And of course, those would be health related to the COVID pandemic. This year, there have been 2. They're typically natural disaster declarations. So think of, flooding in North County by way of example. There are also other things such as a jail heating. There was an emergency proclamation related to jail heating or county operations, things of that nature. So I only raise it because those types of declarations would trigger this clause for the duration of that emergency. So a flooding emergency may only be, 3 or 4 days. A jail heating emergency might be, 2 or 3 days, or until they can get the problem fixed, something of that nature. A wildfire or a wildfire smoke declaration would be for the duration of that event. So it wasn't, I'm sure everyone recalls a couple of years ago, I think we had a wildfire smoke event that lasted, I think it was maybe about 3 weeks. So it would have been the declaration would have been in place in that regard. I would add that price tag that we identified, that fiscal impact, like I said, would be for if the emergency was the duration for a year. We're still under various COVID declarations. Not sure when those will end. But the reason I raise it is the impact to the city then would be largely felt by not only just the pure fiscal impact, but the staffing impact on our payroll staff and potentially folks in the finance department in determining when that declaration was in effect, for how long, and then having my sense is would probably have to hand calculate that impact for our roughly 900 employees. So it's a long way of saying the impact on payroll staff would be immense. It would probably be fairly challenging to figure out, like I said, all those various factors. We'd have to know which declarations were in place when. Any sort of federal emergency, the way this is written, and again, I'll just go back to the initiative language, the way it is written, that a declaration of emergency for any jurisdiction that Bellingham's located in would apply. So if there was a federal declaration of emergency for a hurricane in Louisiana, it seems that this would apply. So we would have to understand all of those various declarations that are in place and do the calculations and understand, what that impact is to our own staff. I would go further and say too that fiscal impact statement is really generated with an eye towards what it would cost for our own employees. It does not contemplate an increased cost in other goods and services that would probably be passed on to the city. So again, the way this is written, believe that it does apply to all workers, and that would have an impact on whether it's labor for a city project or things of that nature. So switching gears a little bit, and I did acknowledge this in the memo, as we discussed a moment ago, we do have 9 bargaining units. Wages are a mandatory subject of bargaining. That's something that I think we want the ability to, as from a management perspective, we want the ability to have that negotiation, and I'm reasonably certain our bargaining units want that ability as well to have that conversation. So, it potentially undercuts both union and management rights. The other provision I wanted to note is the work schedule change. I believe it requires a 2-week notice. We have in some departments, we have 24-hour shifts that if someone is ill, we're able to call someone in. This this appears to challenge our ability to be flexible in that nature from a city staffing perspective. We have at various times across multiple departments have a need for additional staff. In those cases where we've bargained what that overtime rate is, we know in some cases we can call someone up and have them report to work very quickly in the case of an accident or an illness or something of that nature that requires additional staff to come in. It appears that this would challenge that, our ability to do that. I think from a broader community perspective, what we've heard from members of the hospitality industry is that flexibility to staff, to have folks either take on additional shifts. That's something that staff enjoy the ability to do, take on additional shifts from their colleagues or from their coworkers. It would appear to challenge that as well because of that 2-week requirement. So I don't know what questions you might have on that. We did try to articulate, some of the challenges just in terms of how it's written and how that applies for folks and what the city impact might be. But happy to try and answer any questions. I don't know if James, you wanted to add anything.
I don't have anything to add at this point. Maybe haven't answered any questions any council members have about this one.
I would like to add one thing is, unlike the ordinance that council passed for grocery workers, hazard pay for grocery workers, this hazard pay provision in this initiative, it's a very small part of the initiative, has no nexus requirement between the declared emergency and the work that's being done by the worker. If the emergency is declared, the hazard pay applies to all workers regardless of what they're actually doing. So, for example, if you're working inside in a properly ventilated building and there's a declaration of emergency because of smoke from wildfires, you would still be eligible for the hazard pay.
Thank you, Mr. Mariner. Councilmember Vargas?
I will say that this initiative gives me the most concern in regards to some of the impacts, and there's quite a bit to unpack here. So I'll just start with one scenario. So good segue, Alan, in regards to everybody, from the way this is written, it appears that every single person gets the hazard pay, regardless if they are impacted whatsoever, and regardless of whatever emergency it is. So clarification, there are 2 states of emergencies right now. Is that correct? So we'd be paying extra $4 an hour. The city would, as would businesses right now, regardless. So if, let's just say hypothetically, the governor chose to do a climate emergency. If something were like that were to be enacted, that could have no time limit on it whatsoever. And I was kind of just sort of thinking down the process around our budgets and resources and staffing. And let's say we had to pay the extra to all of our employees, how this could impact our resources. And one of the things that I was thinking of is, of course, I have friends who work at the library, and we don't have enough funding for resources at the library as it is right now. So if we get to a place that these $4 an hour charges were exceeding our budgets in huge ways, I'm guessing that means that we would have to start limiting services at the city, because we couldn't. So we would have to maybe limit services that were not emergency. So the library have to do things online. I'm just kind of thinking about how this would affect our budgets. Am I going in the right direction? Is that a possibility?
Well, I think so. And I think to try and answer your question, Pinky, I would go right to section 1, number 1, on purpose and intent. And this is what we're working off of when we talk about what would trigger this $4 per hour. It's hazard pay during any declared state of emergency. So that would require, that's why I use that example. I believe, and I guess I'll ask either Alan or James to correct me, but any declared state of emergency would apply. So whether if it's a federal declaration related to, say, like I said, a hurricane, it seems like that would trigger this clause. And I think, as you know from your time on council, I think when we think about having to reduce spending, for good or bad, we think about it in terms of what services can we diminish to save those dollars. And so prior to my time with the city, during the Great Recession, I believe that was felt most acutely with things like the library, as you mentioned, things like Parks and Recreation Department. So unfortunately, I think, when we're faced with this initiative aside, when we're faced with diminished revenues, the corresponding reaction to reduce expenses, really, we're a service providing organization that comes out of diminishment services. That typically means, what can we do with fewer employees? What service can we continue to provide to save those dollars? And as you all know, last year, just prior to this time, we were faced with that exact scenario, as we felt like we would be in a situation of diminished city revenue. And so our approach at the time was to initiate furloughs. And fortunately, and this will come up later today in the budget conversation, but fortunately, we only had to do that for a short matter of time. But those are the types of tools that are at our disposal, is that reduction of service, really, whether it's fewer hours or fewer people. That's how we achieve those savings.
Councilmember Hudson. Oh, go ahead, Alan.
I just want to clarify, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong. It's been a while since I looked at these initiatives. Same for you, James. But I believe the declaration of emergency has to include the geographic area covered by the emergency has to include the city of Bellingham. So it could be a declaration at the federal, state, or local level, but the city's got to be within the geographic area of the emergency. I just want to clarify that.
Yes, correct. In section 10, number 1, it says, in any jurisdiction which includes the city of Bellingham. I think it is limited in that respect. Councilmember Huffman.
That was my question related to that, because I feel like I'm reading it like Brian had mentioned. If a state of emergency is declared in any jurisdiction, so not that the city resides in, so that the state of emergency is declared in that jurisdiction, which would be this. Anyways, that's needs a little further analysis, maybe, because I wasn't thinking of a federal declaration would trigger this, but the way that this reads, I can see how that is not clear. So that was my question, but I guess I'll move on to another question. This, something that I just noticed is that the title includes gig workers in the description, yet I don't think that I see anything relating specifically to gig workers or defining what a gig worker is, which I assume is an independent contractor. Am I missing something, or is that only in the title? Or and how would that apply if this is approved to independent contractors?
I don't see gig worker defined in the definition section. So section 2, and to your question and to Alan's question, I guess I was thinking in terms of if there was a federal declaration, obviously Bellingham's part of the United States. And so if there was a broad federal declaration of emergency that wasn't specific to a certain region, it seems like this would trigger that. So, but I do not see gig worker defined in the definition section.
I would point out that the title talks about hourly workers and gig workers. The actual text of the initiative doesn't mention, I agree with Brian, doesn't mention gig workers, but also talks about all employees, not just hourly employees. And so it's sort of, there's an inconsistency between the title and the text, which is just something that if it's challenged, that ultimately a court will have to will settle. But I think that the text is if it's passed, is what we would follow.
Mr. Erb, did you want to follow up on that point?
Yes, please. I also want to note that I think Councilmember Huckman pointed out there was a discrepancy maybe between the memo and the text of the initiative with respect to hourly and gig workers. Section 10 of the initiative bill, it uses a different qualifier. It says that employers shall pay all on-site employees $4 per hour, and is clearly not limited to hourly workers, because it says that the employer shall pay $4 per hour in hazard pay, or it's an equivalent in prorated salary premium. So hourly employees and salary employees are totally different. So reviewing the plain language of Section 10, it doesn't only apply to hourly or gig workers. It applies to all on-site employees. And the court would be reviewing that language, not just the court, but any employers in the city of Bellingham would want to review that language carefully to determine whether or not it applies to them. I had a call from a concerned citizen about this particular initiative last week, and they asked about potential liability for employers. And I cautioned them that I was not an attorney at large to answer those types of questions, but they should certainly speak with their legal counsel about the particular rules around wage withholding and wage rebate statutes with respect to withholding wages before making decisions whether or not to pay this hazard pay. Because if you end up on the wrong side of a challenge from employees for not paying wages, there's considerable risk of liability there.
Thank you. Yeah, the discrepancy was noted because in Section 1, purpose and intent, I mean, both 1 and 2 under that section specifically speak to hourly wage and gig workers in both of those sections. But as was highlighted by multiple members of staff, that in other parts of the initiative, it's much more broad. And I guess one of the concerns is if, especially during a state of emergency, when there are increased demands on employers as well as employees with respect to work and unpredictability with respect to hours and scheduling, as well as perhaps a decrease in revenue during a state of emergency. Part of my concern as well is what happens. I mean, when we talk about reduction in services, is the other consequence, potential layoffs and people actually losing their jobs as a result. But Councilmember Hamel, I see you're next.
A question for Mr. Erb. What actions may the council take regarding these initiatives?
Thank you for that question. So at this point in time, as Council President Stone noted earlier, upon receiving certification or verification of the sufficient number of signatures from the county, the City Council had several actions that it could have taken. Right, it could have enacted any one of these measures. It could have deferred them to the voters. It could have taken no action, which in effect would have deferred it to the voters. Or it could have passed a competing measure dealing with the same subject, and then that would create a convoluted vote question on the ballot for all the voters to consider about which one to adopt. But at this stage, the council's option is to vote to encourage the citizens of Bellingham to support or oppose one or all of these measures. Council has the ability to speak with one voice as a legislative body, either promoting or opposing any of these measures. The council has previously done that in several recent elections. For example, last year, the council adopted a resolution supporting a renewal of the transportation fund. The year before, the council adopted a resolution opposing state initiative measure 976, which was a Tim Eyman $30 car tab initiative. Previously, the council had voted to support a statewide initiative providing paid sick leave. So there is certainly precedent for council to review local and statewide ballot measures to ask the types of difficult policy questions that you're asking now, and to adopt a resolution if appropriate, encouraging the citizens of Bellingham to vote either in favor of or against any particular initiative bill. So at this stage of the game, that is really the council's option.
City Attorney Mariner.
Yeah, I just want to add, I agree with everything that Mr. Erb said. I would just say there is one other option, and I think staffs assume this, is to do nothing. You deferred back in July, you deferred these initiatives and to the voters. You are not required to pass a resolution either supporting or opposing the initiatives. You could do that, but that's not required.
Thank you for the clarification. I mean, initially, my thought was that deferring to the voters and sort of remaining silent was the best course of action. But I am inclined at this point to entertain such a resolution if there was support by a majority of the council, because I'm concerned that there's some confusion by voters about what deferring to the voters means. And I've heard a number of community members speak to that deferring the vote was sort of a vote of confidence by the council in support of these initiatives as they stand. And so although I've said I support the underlying principles and perhaps intent of these initiatives, there's grave concern, I will say, with respect to the potential negative and perhaps unintended impacts of these initiatives if they are adopted, as well as we've highlighted, just the concerns regarding interpretation and enforcement. So
I am prepared to make that motion when we're ready.
Okay, so we'll go to Councilmember Lillquist first.
Yeah, just to say, I would be in support of a resolution. I think the more we look into this, the more concerns we raise. I think we have to be careful about what the resolution says, but clearly my concerns have been deepened. My question had to do with enforcement. This initiative seems a little bit different in that it seems to be silent on enforcement. Are we to assume that all enforcement will be a private civil action between an employee and an employer? Because I don't see any other mention, not even of employers have a positive duty to maintain records and comply, but I don't see any enforcement. Is this one entirely a matter of people suing each other in court?
I'll take that question. Yeah, that's how I read this particular initiative bill. Unlike some of the other ones, there is no mechanism to set up a city enforcement scheme. I think, by contrast with the initiative 2021-03 with respect to discouraging unionization efforts, there people can bring complaints to the city to be investigated. The city issues a determination, and appeals of that would go to the city's hearing examiner. Here, there's no such language, and it certainly appears that it would be entirely private enforcement by employees against their employers to the extent that they feel the employers are not complying with the terms of this initiative bill.
Thank you, Mr. Erb. Councilmember Vargas.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with Council President Stone in regards to the confusion that I'm hearing out in the public. That since the city council put this forward, it means that we supported it, but it was more of an obligation. And it does not imply support. And I think that the more that I learn about these initiatives, the more concern I have. They are well intended, but they have details that are broad with legal and fiscal impacts that could be really devastating on not only our city, but our business community that's just trying to survive right now and get through a pandemic. So I would like to get rid of the confusion and hope that there is support from the council. And I'd like to make a motion that we do a resolution to oppose these initiatives that are on the ballot, initiatives 1 to 4. And I'm not exactly sure on the wording on this one. James, maybe you can help me a little bit on that. But like, if we oppose these measures that are on the ballot, is that all we need to say? Or do we say that I'm not exactly sure what we have to do in regards to what our legal stance has to be on how we word that motion. Can you help me a little bit?
Sure. I'll just read to you the resolution that the council adopted back in 2019 with respect to I-976. And you can see if this informs these discussions at all. With respect to that measure, the council adopted a resolution stating the Bellingham City Council hereby expresses its opposition to I-976 and encourages citizens of Bellingham to vote no on I-976 on the November 5, 2019 general election ballot.
That sounds pretty reasonable. If we were to insert the initiatives and change the date, could we use that same verbiage and just exchange the initiatives and this year's voting ballot? If so, then I move that we use that resolution with those amendments.
Second.
So a motion's been made by Councilmember Vargas and a second by Councilmember Knudsen to amend that resolution from 2019 to address all 4 initiatives and the council's opposition to all 4. My question, I guess, was, and then I'll open it up to discussion. My question was whether those resolutions need to be passed individually or if one resolution could address all 4 initiatives, since they have been presented and spoken about publicly sort of as a group of 4. I don't know if there are any restrictions.
I'll answer that question as best I can, Council President Stone. I don't believe that council is restricted from adopting one resolution dealing with all 4 measures. I do agree with you, however, that each time these issues have come before the city council, there's been a separate agenda bill item for each one. They've been discussed separately. Everyone recognizes that they're all separate. So I think it's really a matter of preference for the council in terms of how they want to do it. But certainly I don't believe there's anything that restricts you from dealing with them all in one resolution.
Okay, Councilmember Hamel.
No, we've talked a lot today about sort of the unintended consequences of all of these initiatives, but there's also a lot that's not being said. And we were briefed by legal about the flaws in these proposed pieces of legislation. Those are as much or carry as much weight for me as the things that have been mentioned here today. The legal flaws are many, and I'm wondering to what extent we can or cannot articulate those in the resolution to oppose.
I'll jump in. It seems to me it depends on the timing and by what time you're hoping to vote on this. It's October 11th. Was the idea, Councilmember Vargas, that we would put something together quickly and for purposes of voting on it this evening? Is that what your thought was?
Well, that was my hopes. The ballots go out in 3 days. So I think if the city council is going to share with the city what their thought is on these initiatives, I think urgency is paramount.
I agree. I believe it's October 13th, so in 2 days that the ballots are mailed out. Councilmember Huffman?
I think my thoughts are kind of along the same lines of that subject. It makes me a little uncomfortable to make a blanket statement without more context as to why. Because in part, all of us have mentioned how we agree with a lot of the underlying values of these ordinances. But because we have the time, we have the resources to look into them into more detail, the flaws are presenting themselves more and more apparently as this process has gone along. And so it makes me a little hesitant to just have a blanket declaration without more context as to why, I guess. And maybe I wouldn't be as uncomfortable if we had our own communications director for the council or something to help explain a little bit more deeply what the details of the hesitation with these ordinances are from council. So I don't know if there are further thoughts.
Councilmember Lillquist?
I'm going to suggest a way forward that's slightly different from the motion. The motion is to follow the pattern and come out with a resolution urging voters to not pass the initiatives. That's a higher bar, and we could set a lower bar for ourselves, and it might make it easier to do this tonight, quickly, and in one resolution. I'm conflicted. I don't want to come out against resolutions whose intent I understand and support to a fair extent. I would rather we passed a resolution which, instead of asking voters to oppose them, said something more along the lines of express our deep concern with the initiatives and remind voters that the city council has not taken a position of support. So to clear up the confusion, these aren't from the city. We're not supporting them. But by setting a lower bar for ourselves, I think we can probably more easily write less detailed recitals. We don't need to make an argument for each one because they're different and the concerns are particular in each case. We don't need to expose any of the legal reasoning that we might have heard in confidence. So it'd be a shorter, simpler resolution that would say something more like, upon further review, our concerns have increased, a number of details have been identified. At this point, we say we have deep concern and we have not taken a position of support. It's a softer approach, but I think it's one we can do quickly tonight. And it avoids what I think would be a very long and difficult process, which would be to write individual resolutions which detail the legal reasoning, which the policy reasons and the practical reasons and implementation reasons. There's a lot of reasons, and it'd be maybe better if we avoided having to detail them and instead did something which signaled to the voters, hey, pay attention, we have concerns, we're not supporting them. It's closer to our current source of action, which is trusting to the voters to do their own work. But apparently our silence has been misinterpreted or can be misinterpreted. So maybe it's more accurate to say that we have deep concerns and we're not supporting them as opposed to actively opposing them. I'd be more comfortable voting for that kind of resolution.
We have a motion before us by Councilmember Vargas and a second by Councilmember Knudsen. Are you proposing an amendment or?
I am.
I mean, is Councilmember Lillquist proposing?
Well, I would propose it maybe as an amendment, but if Pinky wants to amend her own motion, I don't know where you are, Pinky. I don't know if you don't like my idea or hate it or love it.
Councilmember Vargas.
I totally understand where you're going with that, Councilmember Lillquist. However, I feel that ambiguity is not where we should be going right now. I think that's kind of what got us here. And it feels a little too soft. I feel like the fiscal and legal impacts of these initiatives, although well-intended, have huge unintended consequences. And so maybe that is an addition that we need to put in that resolution stating why we're doing this. So maybe saying oppose no to the, encourage the voters to vote no due to the unintended consequences of the legal and the fiscal impacts on our city and business community. So maybe inserting one line that does cover all 4 of the initiatives, the legal and fiscal impacts. So it's not just like vague, don't vote no, but why we're doing it. But I am more on the side of be very clear, we are saying no, because the impacts are huge and could devastate our economy in a really scary time right now. So I don't want any vagueness. I want strong clarity. And so that's what I'm leaning towards.
City Attorney Mariner.
Yeah, the legal department could have a resolution along the lines that Councilmember Vargas described for this evening. If you decide to go that way, I would recommend that you read the entire resolution into the record before voting on it.
Thank you. Councilmember Hamel.
Along the same lines as Pinky, I think I don't think we need to be ambiguous with this. I think we need to be completely transparent and straightforward, up to and including the legal issues with these things. And I know that the lawyers hate that because they have to defend these things, or will have to later. But those are real issues. These were written in a way that there's fatal flaws in every one of them. The unintended consequences of that's one piece. And the unintended consequences of reduced library services and parks and rec services will impact people who are marginalized more so than people who are not. And to me, that's not acceptable. So I want to be able to articulate that. Now, I know we need to do a resolution here. We're already after 3 and we still have more items, and the attorney should probably be freed up to do the resolution, but we could do a press release in the next couple of days that really broadly articulate the reasons why we're coming out against this, or these initiatives rather, versus trying to pack it all into one resolution. I think we do the resolution tonight, do a very articulated press release in the next couple of days, work with communications to do that. And that way we can express in detail why we're opposed to these things. So that's where I stand.
Other comments from council members? I'm in agreement with Councilmember Vargas and Councilmember Hamel that I believe at this time we need to be as clear as possible. Really, I'm drawn to want to pass such a resolution because of the ambiguity and questions that have been raised already by community members. So I think it's imperative that we're very clear in what we're stating. I also think it's sort of a not dangerous, but obviously difficult to start outlining, in any great detail, all of the myriad of reasons why, we're in opposition. But if legal is able to come up with some sort of summary statement that addresses those generally, and then there are a couple of pieces I'd like to offer forward. One is obviously working on a press release to provide additional detail. I think that would be wise. The other piece is, because we've spoken to the underlying, perhaps intent and the policy issues that are raised, and that obviously members of the community are supportive of. I don't know if it's appropriate this time or going forward, but to have that invitation. Sitting as council president now, I'm happy to meet with the, proponents of these initiatives to do some additional work, obviously outside the context of the pending initiatives and the upcoming election, but in good faith of hearing that voters have brought these or at least signatories, have brought these issues forward and trying to figure out a path forward when we talked about, is there a way to, rewrite or come up with proposed legislation that might get to the heart of what was the underlying intent, but does so in a means that would hopefully avoid the legal and financial concerns that are currently raised. So we have a motion before us, though, right now that was brought forward by Councilmember Vargas and seconded by Councilmember Knudsen to direct legal and request for a resolution to be brought forward this evening that would speak to the council's opposition for all 4 initiatives. Councilmember Lillquist.
In that resolution, I know that Ms. Vargas referred to the legal and fiscal impacts. I think it might be important to also broadly indicate administrative impacts as well as general economic impacts on the community. At least try to capture the range of issues that were identified. If that can be in the resolution, I will probably be very supportive tonight. This is a really uncomfortable situation, unfortunately. Hindsight, I think we probably all would have responded quicker than before this thing got to this point, but I think this is the best we can do right now, and we shouldn't delay.
Any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? We have Councilmember Anderson absent. So that passes 6-0 with Councilmember Anderson excused. Okay. Anything further on these 4 items?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you. And seeing none, I presume that then legal will follow up or send something for consideration this evening. So if anything further is needed, please reach out. In the interim, we have 2 more items before us this afternoon. So the next is Agenda Bill 23129. This is presentation of the 2021-2022 mid-biennium adjustment. So Mayor Seth Fleetwood and budget staff will present proposed changes to the 2021-2022 biennial budget. And for this, I will first turn to Mayor Fleetwood.
All right. Thank you, Council President Stone and Council. Good afternoon. We've put a lot of work into this over the course of the summer. We're now here to present with you, some proposed changes to the 2021-22 biennial budget. As we indicate in the memo that was in the packet, this budget was built originally as a very fluid document. It was built conservatively. We all recognized why that was when we initially embarked on the biennial budget process a year ago. It was a time of real economic uncertainty and social uncertainty, and the budget was built accordingly. I think we're all familiar with the much improved economic forecast that we've seen this year. Our city revenues have done better than we anticipated when we started off the budget process a year ago. And so we are proposing a number of additions that are going to help us meet demand and an increase in demand for essential public services. We had a very thoughtful, engaged process throughout the summer internally with staff in building this proposal. I'm glad that we're at this stage. We're here in October and officially handing it off to you. Of course, the administration and all relevant staff that work on this will make ourselves available to you in the coming weeks to fully vet this as you deem necessary. Assistant Finance Director Forrest Longman is with us today, and he's going to go over in more detail what we're proposing. So Forrest, take it away.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to share my screen here and have a brief presentation to just kind of go over the highlights. This is not everything that's in the budget adjustment, but again, just the highlights. If you want to see a higher level of detail, there was a spreadsheet included as an attachment to the agenda bill that really goes through in more specific details. So diving right in, as you all know, but I'll say for those who might be watching at home, we work on a biennial budget here at the city. That's one budget every 2 years, and We do change that through the biennium, through budget ordinances, but we do one major change about halfway through. So that's what we're doing. And this, as the mayor said, the biennial budget was developed at a time of great economic uncertainty. So we took a conservative approach. We made very few additions, but we also avoided major disruptions to city services. There were no layoffs. There were no programs eliminated. So we balanced the budget with furloughs and a hiring freeze, which we were able to lift after Q1 of this year when we came back and we did a budget adjustment then, as well as a new revenue forecast. And the city continues to progress on the priorities of the biennial budget. And this adds to that. So just to give you a sense of the revenue situation, and we will have a more detailed revenue forecast for you this evening at the public hearing for the revenue forecast. But 2021 was a time of unprecedented economic growth. There was huge influxes of cash through direct government payments and other fiscal policy. And this is just our sales tax, which is one of our major revenue sources, just sort of highlights very dramatically what happened. We can see we've got our trend line here. This is 2019. We were at $18 million. 2020, it went down about $300,000. But then this year, 2021, we're anticipating almost $21 million. So that's a 16% increase since 2019, which is large. And we're anticipating further growth in 2022, although closer to the mean. And then, so all that extra economic growth outpaced our projections. So here's what 2021 looks like. And I've shown you this chart before. This shows our 5 major revenue sources: sales tax, utility tax, B&O tax, property tax, and other sources cumulatively through the year as they come in. So you can see, property tax doesn't start coming in until April, May, jumps up there. And so this really breaks it down by month. And you can see March is when we came back and we did that earlier revenue forecast. Things seemed like we were on track, and then it just kept outpacing what we projected. So we're forecasting the rest of the year to continue to beat expectations. We think it'll be about a $4.8 million beat for the forecast by the end of 2021. And so that just, again, increases the projections for 2022 by increasing the base and then shifting the model. And this excludes all of the tables, and this excludes the ARPA revenue and expenditures. So what are we doing with all that new money? Well, we're proposing to leverage those new resources for increased services. So that includes investments downtown, adding an ambassador program operated by the Downtown Bellingham Partnership, and increased public works resources, more staffing to increase the level of service downtown for cleaning. We've included funding for an unarmed response for community members in crisis. We've expanded staffing in Parks and Recreation to improve maintenance, upkeep, and safety in parks and on trails. And we've added 23 new positions in the fire department, including a dedicated BLS unit, that's 10 positions, a 5th medic unit, which is also 10 positions, and increased training capacity. In the library, we're continuing library programming that was started for COVID-19 through grants from the state and federal government. That includes a number of things, but highlighting the Wi-Fi hotspot lending program that has been incredibly popular. We're also expanding library staff to help them staff better. We're proposing to add 4 new positions in dispatch. That's 3 on the police side and 1 on the fire side. And we've added communications and outreach staff across the city to increase transparency and timely, accurate information about city services and activities. We've also enhanced our internal services so that we can better deliver services to the community. We need to have the resources internally to be able to make our IT systems and our human resources systems work. So we added 3 positions in IT, one of which will be dedicated to library technology. Added a financial staff in Parks and Rec to help them process all their big projects. And we've added technology staff in HR and police to help them keep up with changes in technology. And I'll remind you, we also added 2.5 positions in HR about a month ago through a standalone budget ordinance to help deal with our hiring queue and make sure we can get positions filled a little bit faster. On the diversity, equity, inclusion side, we've added dedicated funds for a proposed racial equity commission. We're funding further DEI training for the entire fire department and funding to establish Juneteenth as an official city holiday. We're also using this money to plan for future needs. One major dollar amount thing that we're doing is reserving $1.4 million that came from the sale of 600 West Holly for future environmental remediation needs. So we're going to transfer that out of the general fund into our environmental remediation fund, sort of a down payment on that future liability. We've increased funding for our claims and litigation fund. We've had a high number of settlements and claims in that fund over the last couple of years, as you are all aware. We've also seen our insurance costs increase this year. So we're increasing both appropriations and revenues from all the other funds that come into that internal service fund. So that fund operates basically as an insurance policy for the whole city. So all the other funds pay into that. In public works, we've increased staffing to ensure proper management of the biosolids project. Obviously a huge project that's on the horizon, and we want to make sure that we have people there to make sure that that goes smoothly. And we've included funding for design upgrades in Old Town, as well as for the Woburn operations sites. So getting into the nitty-gritty details a little bit, looking at the numbers. Up here we have 2021 and 2022. Beginning reserve this year, we started with about $32 million. This line is the budgeted revenue, and then the new forecast. So we're adding about $5 million in 2021. That's that revenues exceeding expectations, and another $7.7 million in revenue in 2022. And that's based off that enhanced forecast and that base year growing. On the expense side, here's the budget we started with. And in the mid-biennium, we're adding 100,000 this year, which is a number of ups and downs, cleanup things. And then $6.7 million of expenses in 2022. So what does that mean for the fund balance of the general fund? Well, in 2021, we're going to have at least a $3.1 million surplus. This is all based, this chart you're looking at here is based on if everything is expended, everything goes exactly according to plans. These are the numbers we'll get. We all know that doesn't exactly happen. On the 2022 side, we're seeing a $3 million deficit, but I'd like to point out that 2.8 of that is one-time expenses. Those are some of those capital expenses, other one-time expenses, and the ongoing side is only a deficit of $135,000, which honestly is within that margin of error when you're talking about a $96.7 million budget. So we feel pretty good about that being dialed in terms of sustainability for the fiscal health of the city. There's a couple other things that could impact this general fund budget that I'll just bring up. Potential items. The E-team salary study, which was put off for a year after when COVID hit, was relaunched this year, and we're expecting results for that before the end of the year. So that could have some increased budget impact. In addition, 5 of our bargaining unit contracts end on December 31st. So new contract provisions could also impact our expenses. Looking at the whole citywide, 25 million of additional expense and 16 million of new revenue. In addition, there's a $40 million, which is a big number, I know, but it's a technical cleanup of revenue expense related to the 2021 bond refunding. So you may remember actually in 2020, we came to you to authorize us to pay off some bonds early and reissue bonds for that purpose. And that hit our 2020 budget. And this is just to clean up that transaction so it doesn't put anybody out of their budget. So if approved, including all of that, the total biennial budget would be 780 million, up from 713 million. On the FTE side, citywide FTE impact is 49.25. So that's a lot of new employees. We'll point out 25 of those are in the general fund. The remainder are in other city funds. You'll see that a large number of those are in the fire department. So 10 of those positions are for the new BLS unit, which will be ramping up over the next year. That's going to take time to hire up all those positions. 10 of those positions are funded through the Whatcom County Medic 1 levy. That's for that 5th ALS unit, Advanced Life Support Unit, that has been was part of the original Medic 1 plan. And then 3 positions are for training staff, dedicated training staff, to hopefully bring down some of our overtime issues in the fire department. And one of those is a dispatch supervisor position that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Finally, just looking at our long-term general fund forecast, I've shown this chart before. The line is expenses. The blue area is revenues. The green bars are reserves, with the darker portion being our unrestricted reserve. The city has, as a council, generated 15% operating reserve, rainy day fund, if you will. And then the 2 different shades. This is the past over here with the red and the dark blue, and this is the future with the light blue and the yellow line. And as you can see, as we always show you in this chart, in the out years, we start to see a gap between revenues and expenditures. We've closed that gap as we've tried to make this chart a little more in line with reality. We see this year, there's going to be a good surplus. Next year, a potential deficit, but coming a little closer after those one-time expenses roll off. But the good news here is, even with this, what I would call probably a pessimistic view, we maintain unrestricted reserves through the next 2 bienniums. So that's a pretty good position for us to be in. And we're pretty comfortable with this. We know that even though we get this gap, that in reality, we manage it, and it ends up looking like this, with expenses near or below revenues. But just a little bit on what's coming next. We are happy to have some work sessions with council, but wanted to get some feedback from you on what that might look like and what level of detail you'd be interested in. There will be public hearings, 2 public hearings on the mid-biennial adjustment, 1 in each of the meetings in November. And then we'll introduce the budget ordinance on December 6th, with 3rd and final at the December 13th meeting. And also the revenue forecast will be this evening. So I will stop sharing my screen. I believe there was another couple items the mayor wanted to mention. And then I can answer any questions you may have.
Which ones are you thinking of? I could go a lot of places with that.
I think there was a desire to share some information about the weigh station. And maybe did that get communicated? I'll go ahead and jump in if that would be helpful. Or Brian, did you want to mention it?
Oh, I certainly could. For everyone's awareness, and the Way Station Respite Shelter project. It's a project of Whatcom County and Unity Care, I believe. As they await the federal government to take action on their own budget, they have asked, in this case, Whatcom County has asked that the city indicate that we would be prepared to provide a up to $1 million bridge loan just to ensure that this project continues. Absent your objections, if we do need to do that, we would be back before you with a budget amendment. And our proposal would be to use our American Rescue Plan Act dollars to provide that. So that would come out of our overall housing allocation. The $10.5 million housing allocation would come out would come from there.
So, Mr. Heinrich, just for clarification, I believe the gap they were looking at was $1,310,000. I don't know if we were looking to cover that entire gap or just up to 1 million.
Just up to 1 million. The request from Whatcom County was up to 1 million.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know if you needed direct response or support from council.
Well, if there's any objections, I think we would want to know that now. but this has been a project that serves our own needs. I think it's actually been supported in various ways by some of you on council already, if not all of you. So it really just it seems unlikely it will come that we will be before you, but all we really want to do is provide indication to Whatcom County that we're prepared to provide that funding. But in as much as you cross your fingers on these things, we believe the federal government will act over the course of the next few weeks and make this action basically a non-issue. But we do want to provide that letter to Whatcom County so that the project can continue forward.
Okay. And so you're saying you don't require any formal action from council in support of that letter. Okay. And so any objections from council regarding that request? Okay. Seeing none. Councilmember Vargas.
I just wanted to, I guess, give a little overall reflection on the things that you just proposed. And I first of all, I want to say I am so grateful that we are in this place right now. A year ago, I didn't know where we were going to be, and it was pretty scary for everyone. And obviously, some of the support of the ARA dollars and working with the county and the port has allowed us to do some great things. And everything that you have just proposed are things that we've asked for in different ways, over different measures, over many, many years that we've wanted, particularly when it comes to resources and things like the library that everyone uses every single day. And so I think that overall, these are really, really great suggestions and improvements to our budget, and some of them have been needed for a very long time. So overall, I think that these are excellent, and thank you very much to the staff for these proposals.
Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you. So I know this is just kind of a basic budget presentation, but first of all, yes, I'm certainly in favor of a bridge loan to make sure that the way station project doesn't have any cash flow crises. So generally speaking, I agree with what Pinky said. Many of these changes are things that we, the council, have talked about, and now they're showing up in the budget. So I really appreciate putting some money in there for the unarmed crisis response system. We've talked repeatedly about fire department staffing levels. I really appreciate seeing that in there. We talked about supporting the Racial Equity Commission. It's important to see that there's something in there to provide the support that will need. My only question is kind of really small and specific, kind of small potatoes. Maybe we should move it to a future discussion. It has to do with the Downtown Ambassador Program. I'm going to play crotchety old man here. I started talking about a Downtown Ambassador Program with the Downtown Partnership in like 2013. I made some official budget proposals back in 2014 and 15. It didn't quite go that way. We ended up going with the homeless outreach team to address some of the concerns that were affecting the downtown. But I mean, there's a long history of trying to do something like an ambassador program, and I've been supportive, for a decade. I'd like to learn more about what the administration and Downtown Partnership is thinking of in terms of that ambassador program, but I don't think that's a budget level discussion. Kind of maybe move that to some future discussion in whatever the appropriate committee is. I'd like to learn more about that.
We're happy to do that, Councilmember Lillquist. In a meeting soon, there's still some work that's being done to sort of iron out the particulars. And when we're ready to go, we'll look forward to sharing with you at a council meeting.
Thank you. Councilmember Huffman.
I would also like to hear more about the ambassador program. I've heard about it vaguely for quite a while, and I'm thrilled to see that we're funding that. I think that would be really helpful for downtown. And there are so many aspects of this update that I am completely thrilled with. The alternative response team, making sure the funding for the Racial Equity Commission is in there, the additional fire staff. Just one question, little detailed question. So we have 5 FTEs increasing for the police department. It looks like 3 of those are dispatch, and then the other 2, what exactly are those jobs?
Yes, that's right. Excuse me. 3 of those are in dispatch. And one of those is an IT specialist to help with the body-worn camera program. There's a lot of data, a lot of technology involved with that program, and they really need dedicated staff to handle that. And then the other position is a civilian position to handle communications. Essentially, it's a public information's position, so that it will no longer be an officer doing that work. It'll be a civilian staff member.
Councilmember Hamel?
Yeah, I apologize. I was looking at notes and I missed the part on the way station. Can we just back up to that real quick? I know that they have a $1.3 million deficit. What's the investment there?
We're offering, the county has approached us for a $1 million, a commitment for $1 million bridge loan should the federal funding not come through. And so they've asked us for a letter of intent that we would support that. And so we wanted to make sure council was okay with us offering that. We are hopeful that it'll still get the federal funding as anticipated, but if not, we will come back to you with a budget amendment to make those funds available.
Other feedback from council members? Okay, it sounded like you were looking for some guidance regarding next steps and work sessions, and I don't know what level of detail you need from council members regarding those next steps, but I'm happy to poll the council.
I think fundamentally the question was, and what I think we're proposing, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think what we're proposing is that we build in work sessions to upcoming council meetings with the idea that if we need a mid-Monday for some additional work, we would identify it and schedule it. But at this moment in time, I think we're of the opinion that we probably just utilize time on upcoming council members to work through vetting of the budget.
That's correct. We have three normal or regular city council meetings until help me out for us, December 3rd?
Yes, 6th.
6th, 3rd. That's pretty close. December 6th, first and second reading of the budget. So we do believe that, and if it's okay with council, we'll go ahead and schedule budget work sessions beginning on October 25th and that that November, first November meeting, in hopes that we can work through the budget.
Great. And so with respect to those work sessions, I guess, since we have the opportunity, I'd ask if, I know that there's a lot to cover in those work sessions. I guess right now, if council members have any requests with respect to specific areas they'd like covered in any additional depth or work sessions looking at any particular departments or budget items. Otherwise, we'll obviously defer to staff and the mayor. Councilmember Lillquist.
Funny thing happened last year with the budget, which is that it didn't seem to deal heavily with housing issues. And part of that is because the housing budget is on a different cycle. It's a June to June cycle. It's largely, we set the housing spending based on the fact that we're timing it with the federal housing programs. And so, I mean, this budget didn't appear to address housing issues. I now understand that it has to do largely with the fact that that's on a different budget cycle. But I still would like to understand housing and housing programs and where they figure into the budget, because it really is a significant part of what we're doing. And we also, voted to increase the budget or revenues on that for $3 million a year to do with housing, medical services. So in the budget workshops, I'd like to talk a little bit more about our housing programs, realizing that they're actually kind of on a slightly different budget calendar, and their the HUD plan is approved at a different time of the year.
Michael, would it help for what you're asking? It sounds like maybe another presentation or review of the consolidated plan, or what do you?
Yeah, I think maybe a micro review of the consolidated plan, but done at some time at the right point in the budget discussions in general.
Okay.
On the activities that are sort of like thematically related to those issues, that might be the time to reintroduce that. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Because it really seemed like it was like not in the budget last time, but of course it was in the budget, just wasn't in that discussion. So I want to avoid that problem this year and make sure that during those discussions we reference those other programs that are approved on a different cycle.
I think we can do that. Thank you.
Anything further from council regarding this item? Councilmember Knudsen. You're muted, sir.
I want to echo Pinky's word on the budget. I think it's wonderful, but I have a public service announcement. This morning I had a regular flu shot and a COVID booster shot, and I'm having a horrible reaction. So I'm going to lay down for a couple hours and hopefully I'll be okay tonight, but probably wasn't a good idea to do both of them at once. So I just want to let you know, hopefully I'll be back tonight.
Thank you, Councilmember Knudsen. Any other items on this topic? And at this point, this is for information only, and much more to come over the next couple of months. So thank you very much, Mr. Longman, for the presentation, and we will look forward to continued work ahead. So thank you. So the next item before us this afternoon is Agenda Bill 23130. So this is Legal Department presentation on public rights of ways. So the Legal Department will present on public rights of way, including ownership and use issues, street vacations, and the relinquishment of public utility easements retained by the city during prior street vacations. This will be the first in 3 presentations, with the other 2 being presented in Public Works and Natural Resources Committee. And so for this, I have City Attorney Alan Mariner first.
Yes, thank you. Matt Stamps, Senior Assistant City Attorney, is going to take the lead on this. I'm going to have a little bit to say in the middle. I would also note that Steve Sundin, the Senior Planner in the Planning Department who handles street vacations, is also available to answer questions. So with that, I'd turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Alan. Matt Stamps here, Senior Assistant City Attorney. Let me go ahead and share my screen here to get started. All right, did that come through for everybody? Excellent. Okay, as mentioned, Public Works asked the Legal Department to partner with it to prepare a informational series to council on public rights of way. The Legal Department's going to take the lead on this first presentation to the committee of the whole to discuss right-of-way fundamentals, and then also street vacations, and then relinquishment of utility easements. We thought committee of the whole would be appropriate for that, as the full council does vote on street vacations and also on relinquishments of utility easements. And then Public Works will present the next 2 installments in the following 2 meetings. The first being on street maintenance, and then the third and final being on alley maintenance. And those will probably come forward in the Public Works Committee, I believe. So let me see. So today we're going to discuss 3 things. I'm going to start out with right-of-way fundamentals, looking at rights of way from in terms of how they're created, and then discussing their attributes in terms of legal ownership, which then informs the way at least us attorneys think about street vacations, which Alan will then present on, and also informs how we process and think through the relinquishments of utility easements, which I will present on that again to round out the presentation. So without further ado, get going on right-of-way fundamentals. Lawyers, we like to start with the definition, so that's what I'll do here. A right-of-way is the right to pass over or through real property owned by somebody else, usually based upon an easement. And when we're talking about public rights of way, just in common language, we're talking about streets and alleys platted throughout the city. And so public right-of-way typically is dedicated by property owners through the plat process or the land division process. And that's generally done at no cost to the city. And let me just start with an example. This might seem a little academic, but it's a good way to get your mind around how rights-of-way are created. So this here is a plat map back from 1889, where Mr. and Mrs. Strand platted this block here shown in the old town of Seaholm, this is now over by Lincoln and Elwood in that area. And if you look at this map here, you'll see it creates two blocks. Each one of these, 1, 2, 3, 4 is a half block. And you'll see, so the Strands owned that full block at the time, and they platted this right-of-way down the center. And it shows here it's a 60-foot right-of-way with 20 feet alley rights-of-way between the blocks. And then what surrounds the plat is a 30-foot right-of-way that, when combined with the next plat over, creates your 60-foot right-of-way. Now, the dedication language you'll see is down here in the bottom left corner of this plat map. It's highlighted in the red rectangle around it. Now, I'm going to focus in on that here on the next slide. And here's the dedication language. And this is typical dedication language from 1889 all the way through to present time. The dedication language on plats is very similar to this today. And so you'll see here that Mr. and Mrs. Strand, the fee simple owners of this land, hereby declare this plat and hereby dedicate to the use of the public forever all the streets and alleys platted thereon, period. So as you can see, that dedication language is pretty sparse. And it's not what you typically see in an easement and other types of easements where you have a 8, 9, 10-page document spelling out all the terms and conditions of the easement. Instead, it's here, this simple phrase. And so to understand the scope and extent of that language, the courts have developed that over the last 100 years, defining what that means. And so early on, one of the first issues that came up with that language was, what was the nature of that dedication? Was that a transfer of the ownership of those alleys to the public or to the city perhaps? Or was it just an easement? And so the court cases have uniformly held over the years that a right-of-way dedication is an easement to the public for transportation, and that the abutting owner retains the ownership interest in that right-of-way to the center line, and that the city will manage that easement as a trustee for the public. And so an easement is a use right, as I alluded to earlier, that's distinct from ownership, and it's for a specific purpose. And with rights of way, the purpose is transportation, is the broadest term applied to that. And it's transportation of both persons, so public travel, and then also utilities, which the courts talk about that in terms of transporting commodities. And so you can see we have a diagram here. It shows a property abutting a right-of-way. You got the 60-foot right-of-way here showing the two heavy red lines with that ownership interest extending here to the center line. Now, you might ask, well, why ownership matters. And there's three broad reasons here. The first is that the abutting property owner may enjoin or prevent uses that exceed the scope of an easement, or alternatively demand just compensation if the city utilizes a right-of-way for things other than property categories as transportation. So kind of a real-world example of that is several years ago, the city undertook a project to daylight Padden Creek. I guess that's west of I-5. There was about a half-mile long section of Padden Creek that long ago had been diverted into an underground tunnel to drain some wetlands in that area and provide to get set up for the railroad to come through. Well, when the city undertook the project to daylight the creek, the path was chosen through some unopened rights of way. And since that creek would essentially eliminate the use of those rights of way for transportation, the thought was that would exceed the scope of the right of way easement. So the city went out and purchased or acquired creek channel easements from those abutting property owners in order to authorize that use. So that's just kind of a common example if I have to think through the right of way not being city property, but rather being an easement for a specific purpose, that being transportation. So that's the first way ownership comes into play. The other way that you often that comes up is that the abutting owner may use right of way for private purposes, subject to the public's superior right to use that right of way for transportation. So just a couple examples, and familiar ones, is in a developed right of way where a street's been constructed and sidewalk. In commercial districts, the abutting property owners may set up a sidewalk cafe out there in the street right of way, so long as it doesn't interfere with pedestrian traffic. And another example would be for that we require a permit, but yet we recognize they're essentially kind of a right to do so as the neighboring owner, where somebody else could not apply for a permit to set up a right of or a sidewalk cafe in front of somebody else's business because they don't own the underlying fee. Another example would be an undeveloped right of way where no street has been constructed. The neighboring property owner can use that land in any way that's not inconsistent with its being opened for a right of way, a street purpose in the future. So common use is gardening, let's say, or setting up of a children's play equipment, swing set, something like that. Something that could easily be removed in the event the city opens the right of way and constructs a street. Conversely, a property owner is not generally permitted to install a permanent improvement in an unopened right of way, like a shop or a garage or something, a structure like that. That would be a fundamental, it would be very difficult to deal with in the event the city elected to open that street in the future. So moving on to a third reason is that why ownership matters is that abutting property owners regain unencumbered title to that right of way upon street vacation. Some folks talk about it, and even the RCW talks about it a little bit in terms of title transferring from the city to the abutting owner upon street vacation. But the correct way to really think about that is that the easement lifts and the abutting owner just regains unencumbered title. So that's a nice segue to street vacations, and Alan is going to pick up there.
Thanks, Matt. You can show next slide, please. So street vacations are authorized and controlled by both state and city code. And Matt just explained, and this is a really, I think, important principle. The most important principle is that the property owners own the underlying fee to the abutting property owners own the underlying fee to the center line of the right of way, and a street vacation removes or extinguishes that right of way easement so that their ownership is no longer encumbered by that easement. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the street vacation process. Council is familiar with at least some of this. The process normally starts with a street vacation petition from the party interested in vacating the right-of-way. Sometimes it's less formal than that, but when that comes in, that request comes in, the technical review committee, which consists of representatives from Public Works, Planning, Legal, Parks, Fire, and Police meet to determine whether the city will need that right of way, either currently or in sometime in the future, and also whether the request to vacate the right of way meets the city's street vacation policies. So this is a pretty serious review. depends on the particular right-of-way proposed for vacation as to how long it takes and whether there's agreement or not. But after the TRC issues a recommendation, I would say that in my 17 years of handling street vacations for the city, if the TRC recommends denial of the proposed street vacation, the petitioner has never decided to proceed to the public hearing before the hearing examiner, which makes sense because they would be proceeding. They have the absolute right to continue in the process and eventually end up before city council. But if city staff is not supporting the vacation, it's just hard to see how ultimately the vacation would be approved. And the reason I point this out to council is two things. Staff goes through a pretty intensive review of a proposed street vacation. And the ones where we recommend against approving the vacation, those never come to city council, and they happen pretty regularly. But after the interdepartmental review, if it doesn't meet the policies or if it's needed for right away, it in all cases ends there. So if TRC recommends approval, we then move to the public hearing before the hearing examiner. Hearing examiner hears testimony from and reviews exhibits from staff, the proponent for the street vacation, and the public. I should note that before that occurs, notice is provided to property owners within 500 feet of the right-of-way proposed for vacation. And this is a fairly recent addition. Notice is also given to representatives of the Mayor's Neighborhood Advisory Commission and the neighborhood associations. And the last kind of notice is there's posting notice at key places, including on the proposed property that's proposed for vacation. So the hearing examiner, after conducting the public hearing, applies the state and city law and the city's street vacation policies, and she issues very detailed, it depends on the right of way, but it's a very detailed findings of fact, conclusions, and final recommendation. And that's what comes to, and this is where city council gets involved, because that then results in a closed record hearing before city council, where council reviews that hearing examiner's report, the record in total developed before the hearing examiner at the public hearing, and importantly, the city's street vacation policies. And that's what informs city council in making your decision. And you're familiar that there's no new there is legal argument presented at the closed record hearing, but there's no new testimony or evidence. And if you approve the proposed vacation, you are charged with determining compensation, and you must approve a vacation ordinance, which ultimately is recorded with the Whatcom County Auditor. Next slide, please. So the key here, and I want to spend a little time on this, is and this is just the list of the city council street vacation policies. These appeared to have been, as best as I can ascertain, adopted by city council in 1998. And it was back at the time that I believe city council was conducting the public hearings on street vacation. So it was before the hearing examiner took over that function. I would note that these policies were never codified. I would recommend that they be codified, and that they are at this point somewhat out of date, although the hearing examiner still is applying these policies in her recommendations that she issues. And I would just note just a couple of examples. Policy 6, and hopefully you can see this, but the PowerPoint is in your agenda packet. But Policy 6 refers to notice to the Planning Commission and their ability to issue a recommendation. That was something that was before we had the hearing examiner doing the exact same function. Policies 7 and 8 seem to indicate that a proponent for a street vacation needs 100% support of abutting property owners under state law, and we follow state law. You need signatures on the street vacation petition of 2/3 of the abutting property owners. So just some slight differences there. And then the last one, which is the most problematic, is policy 9, which says that the proposed use of the vacated right-of-way should not be considered. And the hearing examiner has a fairly strained interpretation of that, because in all the street vacations that I've handled in the 17 years, it's always there's always consideration given to what is the purpose of the street vacation, what use will be made of the vacated right-of-way. And on that policy 9, it also has in parentheses court opinion. I've been asked by both this hearing examiner and a pro tem hearing examiner for a copy of that court opinion, and I cannot find it. So the only thing that I would say is that staff, Steve Sundin and I have always talked about the need for updating and codifying these street vacation policies. They still work, but they could be better. It'd be an opportunity for City Council to put their mark on that. And I think they certainly should be codified in the BMC. So that's what I have to say about street vacations. At the end, Matt and I and Steve Sundin can answer any questions. And with that, I'm going to turn back to Matt to discuss the relinquishment of utility easements.
All right, thanks, Alan. Yep, you're in the home stretch now, Council. Just a few more slides and we'll be done. This is about relinquishing utility easements, this last section. And state law authorizes cities to retain a utility easement at the time or as part of the street vacation process, which conceptually makes sense. If you recall back to the beginning of the presentation, rights of way have sort of two purposes. One, public travel, and 2, utilities. And so cities are authorized to relinquish or vacate the street portion, but hold on to the utility easement component of the right of way. So in that way, that utility easement just survives the vacation. It's not newly created. It just doesn't get let go. The city generally does, and that's the authority to retain that easement's expressed in state law. And the city typically does so whenever always does so if there's a utility present in the street being vacated, there's actually a pipe in the ground that's being used, or if there's a foreseeable need for some utilities in that street, the vacated street in the future. And so that's a pretty routine occurrence. Council's probably used to seeing that statement in vacation ordinances. So that's kind of the setup for the relinquishment process. It's somewhat common that an easement that's been retained, many decades ago, never gets utilized due to patterns of development, and then the owner of the encumbered property that has this retained utility easement may apply to the city, asking the city to release or terminate or relinquish that easement in order to facilitate private development. Often infill development. And so the city's got a specific process for that, just as it does for street vacations. And it starts out, just to review that, it starts out with an application by the property owner and goes to the Public Works Department, who then analyzes that proposed utility relinquishment to see whether or not it is indeed surplus, or if it's being used or may be used in the future for some future need. If there is a need for that easement, as you might imagine, Public Works denies the application and it ends there. Conversely, if Public Works determines there is no need for that retained utility easement, then a public hearing is scheduled in front of City Council with notice to any impacted property owners, and also with notice to the city's franchise utility holders. And then following that public hearing, there's a decision made by City Council on the relinquishment. One final note, generally there's no additional compensation paid for that relinquishment. And that's due to largely to the fact that fair market value for that property has already been paid at the time of the street vacation. So there's not an additional charge to relinquish that holdover easement. And council sees these on a somewhat frequent basis, actually. This is probably somewhat familiar. You get these as public hearings a couple times a year, I'd say. And so we thought it was worth just giving you an overview of that process. And with that, I think we're wrapped up. We'd be happy to take questions. We've got Alan, of course, is here, Steve Sundin on vacations, and then Eric Johnston as well, who, he's sort of to blame for the presentation. He asked us to do this. So if you have questions for him, you can ask some questions to Eric too.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Councilmember Lillquist first. You're muted.
Sorry about that. I'm going to cut to the chase. I hereby move the City Council request the administration to look at codifying the standards for street vacation decisions. That's basically what the work that Mr. Mariner outlined. This request does not include a timeline. I have no idea how many things are on the list, but I think Mr. Mariner's recommendation is appropriate. And at that time, we should also review, not just codify those 11 terms, but maybe review them for appropriateness as well.
Second.
Motion's been made by Councilmember Lillquist and a second by Councilmember Hamel to bring forward, I guess, proposal for codification of the City Council street vacation policies as outlined. I wasn't certain if that was something, I know we have 2 more presentations coming forward before Public Works, if that was planned to be part of that continued work.
Sort of, not really, but I appreciate Mr. Lillquist's acknowledgement of the lack of a timeline. So I think that if it's okay, we will take that under due consideration and return when it's appropriate. We have discussed this topic at length, as you can imagine, over the last several months. Both Mr. Mariner, Mr. Stamps, Steve Sundin, Chad Schulhauser, and several others have been involved in the conversation. And I think as staff, with direction from the mayor, are supportive of that notion. But we appreciate some time in getting that back. It will not be before the end of this year, I can assure you that, but maybe spring, early summer of 2022.
Thank you, Director Johnston. Just a follow-up question. I just want to be clear that the street vacation policies, so those relate to whether it's a street vacation for public use or utility? Does it apply to both, or would there be separate? Because I mean, most of the time the utility vacations are being made, that decision's being made sort of primarily by Public Works, but then if it comes before council, are the policy considerations similar?
I think there's 2, and Matt can help you with this a little bit. There's a street right-of-way vacation process that is administered through the hearing examiner, and that's a more stringent process. But the utility easement vacation process is more administrative in nature. But I think that's
well.
Go ahead. Yeah,
no, I can speak to that. The short answer is no. Those street vacation policies apply solely to the street vacation. Conceptually, the 2 are related, though, because these easements are usually retained as part of that street vacation. But when those easements that were retained at one time then come forward, many years later to be relinquished, then it's the standard that we applied really is just, are they in fact surplus or not? Meaning, is there a utility need for that utility easement or not?
Okay, I just wanted clarification. Thank you for that. So it sounds like, so we have a motion made by Councilmember Lillquist and a second by Councilmember Hamel to bring forward at some future date proposed street vacation policies for consideration by council. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed or abstentions? Seeing none, that passes 5-0 with 2 excused, being Councilmember Anderson and Councilmember Knudsen. Okay. Further discussion or questions from council on this item? It was brought forward for information only, but so more to come. But any additional questions at this time? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much, though, for the presentation. It was extremely helpful just in, solidifying our understanding of all of the differences and seeing those come forward. As you say, we have some experience with that in the past, and I'm sure to be continued in the future. So, okay.
Thank you.
Anything further on this item? Okay. Seeing none, we have approval of minutes from our last meeting. That was September 27th for consideration.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion's been made by Councilmember Hamel and a second by Councilmember Huthman. Any corrections or changes to those minutes? Seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed or abstentions? So seeing none, that's passes 5-0 with 2 excused, being Councilmember Anderson and Councilmember Knudsen. Old and new business. Councilmember Hamel.
I was going to bring forward a motion here under old and new to amend Bellingham Municipal Code section 20.29, which would call for a 200% increase in density bonus for projects that are at least 51% affordable housing at 80% AMI. And this would be towards the creation of more affordable homeownership opportunities. But I don't feel comfortable doing that because we have 2 council members that are not here, and I just don't think that that's fair. And I don't think we're in a real rush for this, but I will bring that up at the next council meeting. So I just wanted to give folks a heads up.
Thank you for that. Councilmember Lillquist.
Just to Mr. Hamel, would you be comfortable prior to that next meeting just sending us an email outline or maybe even something in the packet? I mean, it sounds like a really meaty proposal. I understand you're not proposing a final thing, but it'd just be nice to maybe get it in writing.
Okay, will do.
Thank you. Other items for old and new? Okay, I have one in that we received notification from Kathy Halko, the legislative analyst over at the County Council. And the Whatcom County Council would like the Bellingham City Council to identify 1 member to serve on the selection committee for the RFP 21-60, Professional Services for COVID-19 Pandemic Response Review. And so as a part of that review process, in advance of the RFP, there's a number of members of that sort of work group or committee, and they're requesting a representative from the Bellingham City Council. And so I recognize as well that we have 2 members absent, but I don't know if anyone who's present this time would like to serve in that capacity. Alternatively, I can reach out as well to Councilmember Anderson and Councilmember Knudsen.
Council President, do we have any idea what the parameters are on that? Is it a monthly meeting? Do we know what the obligation would look like?
So it appears as though the next steps, it says on October 12th, 2021, Council will consider approval of a budget amendment, after which the Finance Department can move forward to release the RFP. Selection Committee will review proposals in November and identify a selected consultant. So I think it's pretty short term over the next couple of months, but it doesn't say anything with respect to frequency. But I could follow up with Kathy to get additional information.
At this point, I'd be willing to put my name forward, but I am no longer on council as of December 15th. So I'm not sure what the needs are or the long-term commitment. So maybe we could pencil my name in now tentatively, unless there's somebody who really, really wants to do it. But if it's just a temporary and will be done before the end of the year, then I'm willing to do that.
Okay. Thank you for that, Councilmember Vargas. And in addition, I can reach out to Councilmember Anderson as well. So, Councilmember Hamel.
Yeah, I think I should probably let folks know that I'm on a team along with the Undersheriff of Whatcom County, Prosecutor Ritchie, Blaine Courts Administrator and the Public Defender to make recommendations on the raft of laws that came out of the state legislature the last session on police reforms and criminal justice reforms. That group met last week and will be making those recommendations to the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force. And we'll be working with our local state legislators to work on some of the fixes there. So just want to give folks a heads up.
Thank you very much for that, Councilmember Hamel, and the ongoing work associated with that. So greatly appreciated, and certainly would request that you continue to keep us apprised of that work going forward. So thank you. Any additional items for old and new business this afternoon? Okay, seeing none, we do have an executive session this afternoon. Before us, we have one item. So that's a litigation matter, Fox versus City of Bellingham. This is with Good for approximately 5 minutes. So we will adjourn this meeting and utilize the link that was sent by Mr. Erb to join the executive session. And then after that, we will be adjourned for this afternoon, and we will reconvene this evening at 7:00 p.m. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you this evening.